Hello, chess friends, and welcome to Azarov's Chess Channel, and welcome to the Airthings Masters tournament in 2020. We have reached now the derby of the tournament. It's, of course, Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru Nakamura. This game is always interesting. There is always this tension between the two of them, and before this round, Hikaru Nakamura was the leader. Hikaru was the only player who got 2 wins and without losses, so Hikaru played so far really an outstanding tournament. Let's check out now the game. It was really incredible what happened. Magnus opened with the move e4. Hikaru responds with the move e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5. Here so far the Ruud Lopez, and Hikaru goes into the so-called Berlin defense. The Berlin defense is one of the most natural responses to the Ruud Lopez setups. Knight to f6, challenging the pawn on e4 immediately. We have castling by Magnus, and we have now knight to e4. We have the so-called real gambit accepted. It is, of course, a gambit line by white, but white can always take back the pawn with the move rook to e8, rook to e1, attacking the knight on e4. We have knight to d6, and Magnus goes now with the move knight to e5. If you take, of course, knight takes b5, then you risk some discovered attacks with knight to c6. That's why bishop to e7 has to be played, and now bishop to f1. It is a natural idea to now go back with our bishop. The bishop, although is on the starting square, but this bishop still has a good activity towards the queen side, and still we have a centralized knight, and Hikaru Nakamura plays now the move knight to e5, which is also a line that has been played, I think, millions and millions of times. Rook to e5, we have castling by Hikaru, and now d4, simply grabbing some space in the center, which is also a natural idea, and now Hikaru goes into a line knight to e8. There are also some lines with bishop to f6. Then maybe rook to e1 can be played, knight to f5, attacking the pawn further, but now I think c3 solves a little bit the positional problem still. But white has the activity with bishop to f4, then followed with knight to d2, or maybe knight to a3, and then bishop to c4. It's a symmetrical game, so I think most of these games in the top grandmaster level would end in a draw in this particular line. So here, after the move d4, here we have knight to e8, rook to e1, played by Magnus, d5, and now comes a very important move, I think. It's the move bishop to f4, because what we can notice now, we have the so-called symmetrical and static pawn structure in the center, which means the pawn structure is symmetrical but also static. The problem for both sides is that you cannot play c4 or c5 in order to make some kind of a dynamic position here in the center. If you make maybe c4 move, let's see from white's perspective, then after d takes c4, you risk to be left with an isolated pawn. The same thing happens if black does the same c5, d takes c5, and then black risks an isolated pawn. So that's why when you have the static center setups like this, it's very important to go into positional trades of pieces. So when we can notice, what we can notice is, of course, that white has a pawn on dark square. So that's why white would love, for instance, to trade off the dark square bishops and go into favorable, maybe slightly favorable continuation with the move bishop to d3. Then the bishop, the light square bishop, would be a powerful piece, and still in long terms, black's light square bishop could be only used maybe as a defensive piece to protect the d5 pawn. But that's simply these are simply dispositional trades of pieces. Still, this is an equal game, and I think not that white doesn't have so many winning chances. I think Magnus played this line in order to slow down the pace, because Hikaru is, of course, a great attacker. If you go maybe into a favorable line of Hikaru's, then you could also lose some games. So that's why I think it was a pragmatic idea by Magnus to go into this particular line. So after move bishop to f4, you see bishop to d6, and Magnus goes now queen to f3. After bishop takes f4, we have queen takes f4, and now queen to d6, and Magnus goes queen to f3, knight to f6, normal idea, and now knight to d2. You have to develop, of course, your minor pieces, and now bishop to g4, queen to g3. That's what I meant. We want to go now into favorable endgame, a slightly favorable endgame, although the evolution is about equal. But when we watch this bishop's activity, I like simply more white's light square bishop. Here in the game, Hikaru took queen takes g3, we have h takes g3, and now rook to e8, competing, of course, on this only open file. It's, of course, the e file, and now f3, played by Magnus, which was, I think, a very important move. After bishop to d7, we have g4, blocking out a little bit the king side. Still, the pawn structure is symmetrical, and what both sides, I think, in these positions are searching are outposts. from black's perspective, we would love to cement the knight here, maybe on e4 or maybe on the square c4. But so far, you see this squares Magnus Carlsen is protecting. On the other hand, Magnus wants to occupy this squares, e5 and c5. So that are the squares that Hikaru, I think, has to protect. So that's why these ideas, these positional ideas, are meeting this normal static center setups where you want to search for outposts and some kind of a dynamic positions then in the continuation of the game. So h6 here by Hikaru. We have king to f2, very important move, because if we trade off maybe one pair of rooks, then we want to play freely with maybe our a rook somehow, and we don't want to risk this rook to come maybe in long terms, not immediately, but in long terms we don't want to risk this rook to come maybe on an active square like e3 or maybe e1. The king is protecting these two squares. It's a very important move. So here rook to e1, we have rook to e1, rook to e8, and now Magnus goes rook to c1. As I said, immediately to play c4 is very risky. Magnus is, I think, not preparing this move c4. What Magnus doesn't want to do is simply trade off the rooks. If you play c4 after d takes c4, as I said, you risk to be left with this isolated pawn. So that's why first Magnus wants to stay with the rooks on the board. We have c6 and now a4. This is a very important move by Magnus. What he's doing here is blocking a little bit black's progress on the queen side, because black could do something like, I don't know, b5, maybe something like knight to d7, and then maybe search some kind of an outpost here, maybe try to remaneuver the knight somehow here after potential b5 move. Maybe we could cement it somehow here on c4. So it's a long road of the knight, but as I said, we're searching simply for outposts. So that's why this idea by Magnus was a very important one, to play this move a4 to block potential fixing position on the queen side. Here after move a4 we have rook to e7, we have a5 blocking further the queen side, knight to e8. Then you see now Hikaru is searching for this this potential knight outpost on c4. So that's why you see if b5 would have happened, then knight to d6, then maybe here knight to c4 would be really nice position then for black. So knight to b3 by Magnus, he is searching, as I said in the beginning, knight to c5 or knight to e5. These are the squares that we are targeting. Simple ideas of the static center positions. Knight to d6, we have knight to c5, and I think if you come now here with the knight, that Magnus Carlsen would have taken immediately this knight after d takes c4, then maybe c3, and then maybe search for a good square for a knight, maybe even trade off the rooks, and then maybe try to fix the knight maybe somehow here on e5. So then I think this knight, knight that can jump on dark squares is much better than the bishop that's only used maybe to protect this pawn on c4. So that's why here after the move knight to c5, bishop to c8 played by Hikaru, what he wants to do is then to kick away the knight with the move b6, because he wants also to restrict this important square. It's the weak square on a6. So here b3 played by Magnus. He's now preventing this idea further. The knight cannot jump anymore on c4. We have g6 and now c4 played by Magnus. Now c4 is working, because after d takes c4 that was played in the game, b takes c4 by Magnus, and you see now we don't have an isolated pawn. We have now the hanging pawn structure, and it's much better. These are flexible pawns. You can move them forward. You can make something happen. You can create dynamics. You can maybe create a pass pawn. But okay, nothing went wrong here for Hikaru. Still, it's in about equal position. Maybe slightly better for white, but it's still playable. In the game, Hikaru tried king to g7. We have bishop to d3, and now f5. G takes f5, bishop to f5, and bishop to e2. What we don't want to do, as I said, is to trade off the bishop. Then the pawn, then the position is more and more simplified. Bishop to e2. We still want to keep our pressure here on the queen side. In the game, Hikaru tried h5. We have knight to d3, and if you take now bishop to d3, bishop takes d3, we would have sort of an endgame in which pawns are on both sides. And as a long-range piece, I think it's better now to have the bishop against the knight. So that's why taking out also the bishop for a knight is not a good option here for Hikaru. In the game, he tried again bishop to c8, knight to b4. We have knight to f5 attacking the pawn, and now e5, d5 here by Magnus. We have c5. If you take, maybe Magnus could create here a pass pawn situation. This knight is protecting this pawn very good, and you see now we have also opened this this file. If bishop to, I don't know, maybe something like d7 happened, then we can also get use of the 7th rank, which could also be dangerous. Maybe if you remaneuver, then we can also maybe trade off the rooks and then push this pawn simply further. So it would be also a risky idea here for Hikaru. So in the game, c5 played by Hikaru. We have knight to d3, rook to c7, and now knight to f4. We have h4. Very important to keep now many of your pawns on dark squares, because you see both players have light square bishops, so you want to have your pawns on this opposite colored squares where the light square bishop cannot attack them. We have bishop to d3, we have g5, and now Magnus plays knight to e2. We have knight to d6, knight to c3, and now king to f6, rook to e1. Bishop to d7, knight to e4. Here, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4 has to be played. If you play f takes e4, then you risk a really nice positional idea here by black. Black can create a blockade with the king and can go now, I think, in a favorable endgame, because black would then have a 2 versus 1 situation, could create a pass pawn. This king is very, very good here, centralized on e5, although white has this supported pass pawn, but this king is simply too powerful in the center, so that's why it's not an option here. Magnus has now to take with the bishop to e4. Here b5, we have d6 by Magnus. Very nice idea. There's only one square for the rook, rook to c8, and now we have c takes b5, bishop to b5, and now rook to b1. Magnus is slightly faster with his rook. The rook occupies now a very important square. Maybe now a6 would be the best move here for Hikaru. Maybe rook to d1 can be played here by Magnus, trying to push this pawn further, but then maybe c4. You see, Hikaru can also counterplay here. After d7, we could simply play rook to d8, and then maybe after a check, still this is defendable. We will take simply out this pawn, although maybe Magnus can now take also, but the king is now very, very near towards this pawn on a5, so it could be playable. But here Hikaru makes now maybe really his main mistake, first mistake at least, the bishop to c4. Here Magnus has now the opportunity to get this rook very, very active in the game. We have a rook to d8, and Magnus simply takes. After rook to d6, what we can notice now, the material is equal, but Magnus has the slight advantage of the distant pass pawn. So if this pawn could be pushed further, then many pieces of black are deflected to the queen side. And if you, for instance, try to get your king towards the queen side, then maybe our king could go and find a path and go after this pawn. So that's why it's very, very tricky, this bishop pawn rook endgames, and maybe some rook and pawn endgames. But still, this is an equal position. Nothing again went wrong here for Hikaru. If he plays this endgame perfect, then still it's a draw. Here rook to c7, simply attacking the pawn, and now Hikaru plays rook to d2, king to g1, and now comes really, really the critical moment of the game. Here Hikaru should have maybe played something like rook to d6, again retreating with the rook, and he played now a huge blunder. It's the move bishop to d5. I'm not sure if that was a mouse slip or if Hikaru wanted to simplify the position further, going into a rook and pawn endgame. But now here rook to d7 played by Magnus. Very important pin. You cannot take the bishop, you lose the rook. So that's why here Hikaru had to play king to e6, now rook to d8, and now c4. And now comes really the best move, I think, in the game. It's the move a6. You can simply push this pawn further. Here c3 played by Hikaru, but now Magnus goes now into a very, very cool endgame line here. Rook to d5. Whatever you do, for instance, if you try here c2 to push the pawn further, we can simply take bishop takes c2. Is the possibility. Let's see, rook to c2, then we can play rook to a5, and again it's winning here for Magnus. If you try, for instance, rook to d5 here, then you get pinned, bishop to b3, and again you lose the game. If you try king to d5 here, then you get simply a7, and you cannot retreat. You see the rook is blocked out by the king. If you take the bishop, of course, we'll simply promote the queen. So here, after the move a6 and c3, rook takes d5 played by Magnus. And here in this position, Hikaru resigned. So there's nothing you can do here. If you try even rook to d5, then this bishop to d5 comes with check, king to d5. Then we're simply pushing further. You can push the pawn on c2, but now, a8 comes with a check, and it would be game over. Fairly, Hikaru Nakamura realized his mistake, and he resigned the game. Really, I feel a little bad for Hikaru. He played for an outstanding defense. Also, there were many good lines. I think for Magnus Carlsen, it was much easier for Magnus to play this game. Hikaru found good defensive moves, but then in the end he made a huge blunder with the move bishop to d5, and Magnus is now the leader of this very cool tournament. So. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. If you want to see more games from this tournament, check out my Airthings Masters tournament coverage so far. Here's the link, and if you want to see maybe the best chess games of all times, check out my best chess games of all time series. Here's also the link, and if you like this content, you can also subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.